So here's the thing. Are we jumping out of the drought? Is it churning butter? And all of a sudden there's a stepping stool for us to get out of this trough we've been in for the last, 49 months. A few weeks ago, we talked about the eulogy of the last 49 months. And today we're going to dive deeper into that and what the numbers are sharing with us. Hey there, my friends. Welcome back to the Logistics Life. Dean, I'm telling you, man, when I got the text saying this is what we're going to talk about today, I was super excited. I missed the whole emoji thing, but I was super excited. How are you, my friend?
Yeah, good, great. Yeah, it's fantastic to be with you as always. But today's a big day, Dan. Like today is the day that
interest rates dropping. Great news on the rate front, and a whole bunch of things. I'm going to let you dive right into them, man.
Yeah, I'm not sure great news is the word, as the phrase, but better news, certainly better news. But heck, if the Fed drops interest rates, I think the question today is not if, but by how much. Because what the Federal Reserve is trying to do is stick the landing. That, to use a aircraft analogy, they've been cruising along at the same level of interest rates for almost a year now. So it's a very interesting situation. They raised interest rates 11 times in 16 months to try and put the brakes on this overheating economy. And then interest rates sat where they'd been for about just over 12 months. So this will be the first time they've dropped interest rates in a long time, which is what we're all hoping for as some sort of a stimulus to capital investment and some of the pain that everyone's been feeling with inflationary impact on pricing. So today is huge from I think a market sentiment, consumer sentiment. Are we finally turning the corner? That's sort of, which is, part of the goal of the interest rate rise in the first place was to slow things down. That absolutely happened in the last year. Things slowed way down, as we've talked about ad nauseum on the show here. But two data points came out this week that actually are, I think, really good news. Now, as always, the caveat is 1 month of data does not make a trend. But after what we've been through, this is like the first time we've seen a couple of data points line up where it shows in August things improved a little bit. Now, they didn't improve on the rate front because we've still got excess capacity. There's no question we've still got way too many trucks in the market, both Canada and the US. But the data points that I took some comfort in yesterday, the CAS shipment index. So for those that are new to the CAS freight index and payment system, CAS is a freight payment company. I think it's well north of 30 billion in freight payments they process. Includes a bit of intermodal and LTL in this index, but freight volumes were up 1% last month. They were up 3% in July. So that's great news. So we're seeing a little bit more volume start to move. That means demand has improved. It's a little bit behind where it was last year though. So I'm not, we've still got some pretty negative year-over-year comps. According to Tim Denoyer, he thinks that this was the smallest decline in 18 months in terms of the year-over-year number. He thinks growth, slow growth is underway in goods demand, reduced pressure on some of the shipments we've been seeing. So slowing capacity, also slowing capacity exits also add to that situation, but we're still seeing capacity exit. The other data point though, Dan, I think is probably more instructive for truckload carriers is that it's a pure for-hire trucking ton-mile index that Jason Miller puts out. It's the TTMI, the trucking ton-mile index that we've talked about on the show. The chart showed that for-hire trucking ton miles increased almost 1% in July. So remember, this is a lagged indice. This one comes out on a 45-day lag. So 45 days after the end of July, this indice comes out. So it's not high frequency data like the Sonar tender volume index would be, which is sort of a daily look at what capacity is doing. This is more of a lagged indicator, but it's based on 41 freight producing commodities. So it's really representative, I think, of the manufacturing and consumer side of our business. So up almost 1% in August, that's important, but just down slightly compared to this time last year. But it's one of the smallest negative year-over-year readings. I'll quote you some of the things that Jason wrote on his LinkedIn post, and he said that his index in August showed some strength for the first time in a long time, such that there's a little bit more confidence that freight volumes have indeed found a bottom, and with interest rates coming, are set for improvement, especially in the first half of next year, as those cuts start to have time to work through the economy. This is a really important point, because I think what drives a lot of our improvement in truckload demand is not just that we're at the bottom and lifting off the bottom in terms of demand, because the economy's been slowed right down. Interest rates, if they get 50 basis points or 0.5%, a lot of us think that we'll see trucking demand improve in the first half of next year. But those interest rate cuts today are needed to, jumpstart demand for capital investment, machinery, construction, motor vehicles, which, feed into manufacturing and ultimately tonnage that we haul. So there are a couple of data points that came out this week that really show that the market has bottomed out. We've certainly seen it on the rate front. Rates have bottomed out and are starting to improve, but very slowly. I think that the caution here is that we'll see an improvement in the truckload demand side, Dan, because of seasonality, right? Because we're heading into the busier part of the freight season. And if capacity continues to exit like it did in July and August, we could see, a tightening in rates. Now, if you wanted to ask, where do I place my bet? It's on that not happening, because I think there's a lot of capacity still sitting in the market that will keep a lid on any sharp movement in rates. Remember, we talked on the show a couple of weeks ago about latent capacity that's coming into the market when there's a surge in demand and then it backs off when the demand drops. That has a tendency to keep a lid on rate movement. So it's not like we're going to see a linear improvement in rates as demand increases and capacity drops. That won't be the case, I don't think, in this market cycle. And there's a couple of reasons. One was a very interesting data point that came out yesterday from the guys at ATBS, Todd Amon's company. I don't know if you would know Todd Amon by name, but they had some very interesting data points yesterday that speak to the numbers in the truckload industry. They process about 20,000 owner-operator P&Ls every month, right? So, and I can just pull up the data points here that show carriers are running more miles. So if you say, what does that mean? I think the miles, I'm just trying to get the numbers here. The miles are up. Miles were up in the order of 6.7%, Dan. So think this through. So if carriers are running more miles in the last year, what that does is it increases capacity, right? But if carriers have been leaving, because the theory is that if carriers are leaving, that changes the capacity, but it doesn't change it much if trucks that are left are running more miles. So what you've seen is, even as demand has dropped and rates have dropped, carriers typically do what they always do, and that is to compensate for lower rates per mile and revenue, they run more miles. And miles are up 6.7% to an average of 93,000 miles in the last 12 months. Independents up 5.4. Dry van carriers have increased their mileage the most. They're up 8% to almost 98,000. Flatbed carriers up to about 85. The interesting data point, reefer carriers have upped their annual mileage by 5% to 102,000 miles a year. So that's very interesting, because reefer carriers are running almost 21,000 miles more per year than their dry van counterparts. So the data points that I think are important to watch is that and this kind of supports my theory that capacity will keep a lid on any linear movement in rates. And that is that if trucks are running more miles each year, that's adding capacity to the market, which has the same effect as more trucks entering the market, more net trucks entering the market. So we've got this weird situation where rates have dropped, revenues drop. To compensate, carriers are running more miles, adding capacity to the market. And while ever demand has been soft and sliding sideways, it's kept a lid on spot rates and contract rates to a certain degree, which is still dropping. So So we're seeing signs of improvement on the demand front. I think what I'm trying to say is it's going to take time before we see this market seriously flip from where it's been, which has been a grind. And I think we're still looking at the first half of next year before we see those signs.
You know, I'm as you were speaking, Dean, I read an article yesterday. I just went and found it again.
Yep.
You know, there's a couple of things that I've seen over the last little bit. So in the last probably week, I've heard of 3 different major construction projects going bankrupt. One being right behind my father-in-law, up in Northern Ontario, in a town called Midland, Penetanguishene. And this was a duplex subdivision they were putting in an old park, and you know, just getting more people in. And they were doing things like, if you're a nurse or a doctor and you come to this town and work, they will pay for your schooling, meaning like whatever your school debt was, they'll pay it, and you know, give you good rates. And they went out of business. There was a low income housing in Sudbury. Do you remember month or two ago, probably more like 3 months ago, when you were asking, you know, where's all this steel going up into Sudbury? Well, it was a low cost income housing that was being built, and the developer ran out of money. He went bankrupt, or they went bankrupt. I don't know if it was he or whatever, but they went bankrupt, and the city of Sudbury took over. And it was interesting because I was speaking to a colleague yesterday who was telling me all about it, and I was like, wow, okay, keep going. And then I look at the slowing pace of the subdivision going up around my house, and now they've put occupancy in. I told you this a couple of weeks ago, because my son's on the volunteer fire department. So it's interesting how I see these things moving. And then I was reading an article yesterday where the Bank of Canada cut interest rates to 4.25%, cooling inflation. Not only that, the Bank of Canada has now in the inflation rate finally hit the Bank of Canada's target. But it was interesting. So the rate came in at 2.2%. But here's the interesting thing. In one of the statements that they were talking, they say, for example, if a steak used to cost $10, it now costs $20. That price of $20 that you're now paying for a steak won't increase at any rate higher than 2%. So I look at that and I start saying, okay, from just an economic perspective, right? If interest rates drop, it's cheaper to borrow money. If it's cheaper to borrow money, companies might be purchasing more products. Companies might be shipping more products. Some of these projects, you know, I remember I was telling you, my brother-in-law works a lot with a lot of OEM, and they put so many projects on hold. If some of these projects start ticking, I know there's excess capacity in the market, and this is where I'm getting to the question for you, my friend. Eventually, I'll come around to it. But if this ticks, I mean, I understand it won't be necessarily a flip because there is excess capacity in the market, but I'm wondering if it's going to at least improve the amount of orders on the market, and maybe not flip the market, but be a little bit more sustainable, even at even if we say the numbers are where they are now, right? The people that can afford to operate are still going to operate. It's minimum margins, but I think that's the first step, as opposed to, you know, even with the storms coming up, and we, you know, they were talking about 80% more activity on hurricanes and storms and stuff, but we haven't seen any of that. So I'm thinking in my head, and I'd love your thoughts on it. It might just be this slow, steady incline, which is okay as well, as long as it's not going the other way. Does that make sense?
Right. So I think you're dead right. I think the key point from Jason Miller's post this week was it takes time for the drop in interest rates to trickle through into the economy. So think about flatbed carriers. On the ATVS webinar this week, flatbed carriers were saying, well, via the host, that they're seeing a lot more volume trickle into the market because of the infrastructure bill.
Yes.
Right, which was a long time ago, right? But it takes time for those. I mean, you just drive around and see all the developments on the roads and the highways and all sorts of infrastructure projects. So it takes time for that to trickle through both the policy development, the lawmaking, the appropriation of funds at a regional, town level, and then the project starts once they get all the approvals. So that's taken a lot of time, but flatbed carriers are seeing that trickle through. I think it'll be the same here. I think what you'll see, Dan, this is why people are saying, and I think they're right when I say people, some of our most respected economic analysts in trucking, it'll be the spring of next year, because two things will happen. The flow-on effect of dropping interest rates will have occurred, and we'll see improvement. March also is the start of construction, building, planting, machinery season, right? So it's the replenishment of mulch outside Home Depot and Lowe's and Canada Tire, right, with pallets of mulch for the spring season. So that's when you'll see the washout of capacity reach its nadir, its low point, right? And then you'll see demand pick up, and that's when I think you see the inflection. And by inflection, I mean the observable shift in rates that tell you the market has really flipped. We're off. We're already into that phase where there's year-over-year rates are starting to improve, but we haven't got to a point where you could say this market has flipped and it's now a carrier-broker market, because it's still a shipper market. Shippers still have pricing power. And I was with some shippers early in the week, and they are adamant they're going to have pricing power well into next year, because they're locking in rates now for next year. And carriers are trying to push back and say, no, rates are going to be higher next year for the freight we're negotiating on now for 2025 volumes. So shippers still think they have pricing power. And to a degree, they're still right. When you look at the numbers, I give you the latest numbers, Dan. Replacement rates are coming in about 3% lower than the rates they're replacing in routing guides. So shippers are still enjoying this amazingly long period of rate reductions. And then in the same room, there's some large truckload carriers saying current rates aren't sustainable. So there's this push and pull going on at the boardroom table around where rates are going to be next year. But I think when demand starts to really pick up, and you see, the data point I'm watching for is my old company's tender rejection rate, the Sonar OTRI, the National Van Outbound Tender Reject Index. It's still, I think, 4.4% the last time I looked at it. That means carriers are accepting 95.6% of loads that shippers send them. That's historically low. When you see carriers, large truckload carriers, start to reject a higher percentage of loads, that will tell you that there's more loads than trucks. And that usually signals a fairly steep upward movement in rates.
So I've got a question about that. And you're way more versed in this than I am. But my question starts becoming with the rejection side of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if rejection now, as opposed to rejection in the past, is maybe going to be more along the lines of, and I'd love your thoughts on this. And obviously I've got no data to back it up. It's just kind of a thought, but more along the lines of, I've had to switch where my capacity goes. Sure. I'll take it now because there is nothing else. But if I don't need to run the extra 80 miles, I'm not going to run it. So not necessarily for what the shipper's paying, but because of the shift in carriers' service markets, right? Like I know a lot of carriers that used to service California religiously. They've now shifted because produce isn't what it was out of California. There's all the challenge. There's more bylaws and all the other things in California. So they're shifting their service markets. But what they're doing is they kind of right now, even though they're running an extra 200 miles to get the load, as soon as something comes up closer, they're going to take that. And not necessarily because that rate doesn't work. It works if you're in that area. But I'm wondering if there's that piece of the puzzle that we're now dealing with where maybe we didn't deal with that in the past as much.
It's still there, Dan. You've always got, let's use our favorite word on the show here, geographicality.
Yes, sir.
Here. We need a bell or a gong or something every time we hit that milestone. That's the first time I've ever pronounced it correctly. Geographicality. Anyway, so I think, Dan, at a regional market level, you see vastly different rejection rates. And yes, you're exactly right. It's got a lot to do with capacity. So when I talk about national outbound tender rejections at 96% acceptance. That's the national level. But in Los Angeles, it could be 12%.
Yes.
In the refrigerated market in Joplin, Missouri, 3 weeks out from Thanksgiving when fresh turkeys are moving, it'll be 50%.
Yes.
Because there's way more loads than there are refrigerated vans out east of out near the Mississippi River where the turkey farms are. So I think you're exactly right. But whatever the national level is sitting under 5% rejection rate, that's telling you that the variance, the range of data points at a market level is still fairly tight.
Yes.
Right. So if for example the national was say call it 5% rejection rate, well let's be a little bit more realistic. In longer term trends, if you go back to say 2018, 19, 20, the average tender rejection rate is probably in the 12 to 15% range. That means that at market level it could have been 40 to 0 as a range either side of that at national average. So I think whatever you see, and we've seen the low tender rejection rate for months and months. I think it's all of this year we've seen low tender rejection rate. That tells you that at a market level, the range of variance is fairly tight around the 4%. Right? So, but I think when you get to flatbed and reefer, there's a very different scenario because there's less equipment in the market and it's more live load, right? As opposed to dry van, drop and hook. Reefer motors, reefer trailers are more live load, same with flatbed. And you see more one-to-one trailer to truck ratios in refrigerated and flatbed because of the specialized nature of the work. Dry van, it's typically 3-to-1. So that's why I think you see different capacity impacts on the rejection level. It depends on the equipment type as much as it does the total number of trucks hanging around the market. Yes. And then the volume that shippers are sending out. But the clear trend is that the carriers are accepting almost everything that a shipper sends their way, which tells you they're still searching for equilibrium in the market. Now, the first tell will be when we get into the first surge of shipping volumes in sort of the end of October, you get into that Halloween phase of shipping, and that really starts the holiday season. If tender rejection rates start to go up and acceptance rates drop, then you'll know the market's starting to tighten, that we've reached that equilibrium point.
So it's interesting. I had a conversation with a friend of mine that's at a fairly large truckload carrier. And I was asking him about some of these rejection rates. And he says, well, what we're actually doing right now is we've got to deal with our customer because we have contracts signed where if we decide that, for example, they've got, call it 15 loads out of this location. And he goes, and I might have 5 trucks scheduled. He goes, but I'll take all 15 because I can broker the other 10 out.
Right.
And so I was like, really? He said, and because I guess, I should have thought through it a little bit more, but it was always that perspective that as a large truckload carrier, if you're accepting the freight, you're accepting it on your trucks, which isn't the case.
No, not at all.
No. So it's he said to me, he said, Dan, like our capacity is shifted in their dry van. And he said, our capacity is shifting constantly. He goes, I feel like it's every week. I know it's not, but I feel like it's every week because we're going where the volume is and we're going where our drivers can get miles. Because he said, right now, it's not necessarily about trying to make a lot of money. He goes, if we break even and just keep our drivers for this next little stretch, and he's calling it a little stretch, little stretch could be 6, 8, 10 months. But in comparison to what we've been through over the last 5 years, 6 years, he said, if I can just keep drivers, he says, this is every conversation we have as a company is about how are we going to keep our drivers happy? Because when the market turns, we need these drivers. And I said, so in actuality, if we're looking at rejection rates, they're not based on assets, it's just based on accepting loads. And he says, well, that's how we work. He goes, I don't know how anyone else works, but we work like that. So I thought it was really interesting because he said, we have other carriers we work with where we share freight back and forth, and carriers from what and again, this is obviously secondhand information, but and I trust the source, but he said from what we've done over the last little while is we've created carrier networks that we never used to have before. Excellent. right? Which is awesome. And he said, he said, Dan, it's nothing to do. He goes, yeah, there are some brokers we don't like dealing with. He goes, I think everybody has that. He said, but what we do is we're trying to keep as much of the business, he called it in-house, which means in his network as possible, because we know when the market turns. If we just keep rejecting it and telling this customer, no, we can't do it, somebody else will come in and take that spot.
Exactly.
It was an interesting conversation. So what I started doing after that is I started calling a lot of broker friends and asking them the same question and saying to them, okay, so what happens when, say, your margins are being cut, and a couple of them came, and it was mixed conversations. Like some of them came back and said, you know, I'll let them go with somebody else, and when they fail, they'll come back, which not sure I'm all about that process. But the second piece of it was, you know, Dan, I'm taking the freight. I'm doing what I can. Now, let me obviously add some context to this for you, Dean. This is not brokers that typically go to spot market, find carriers, and try and lowball people. These are people that have really good relationships with their suppliers. And he says, you know, the conversations, one gentleman told me, you know, my conversations are probably 10 times more than I've ever had about, okay, this is what the customer's saying. What do you think? What do you think? Can we do this? Can we do this? What's the long-term goal? Like, what's the long-term output? So it's a conversation that I've very rarely had, except with really, really good suppliers in the past, where it's, okay, this is where we're at right now. In order to keep the business, we got to drop 6% to meet market trends. Yes, I know we're not doing spot market and spot bid and all this kind of stuff, but you got to understand, people are calling this customer 50 times a day, offering these numbers. So eventually that customer has to say, I have to try it, because this is their career. This is their, you know, livelihood on the line. So the conversation is, and then when market turns, the customer has said, we will return to normal, but we have to kind of work the market as it is. And I believe, you know, we've talked about this many times. I think this process is a really good process, because I've been there where I've said to customers, I broke my back for you, and how dare you? I mean, I lost a $37 million company because of it, because I just didn't have those conversations. So I learned the really big zero hard way, And I love that fact. And I love the fact that carriers are working within their network. I see more people having the conversations that maybe we weren't ready to have 5-6 years ago, before things started flipping. And you know, if you go back to 2009, for example, like kind of, this has been a longer drought than 2009, but even 2018, 19 didn't stick around because of the pandemic, So 2009 is kind of the second longest drought we've been in. That drought, I found, and please, anyone that share your comments as well, because you might see something different, but I find the cutthroatness, if that's a word, is not happening at the levels that it happened in 2009. And I don't,
carrier broker side.
Just people cutting each other's throat to save their own. And it could be maybe my mindset was different in 2009 or whatever. So if any of you are watching and listening that have seen different things, please add it into the comments, share with us, get a hold of me. I'd love to hear your comments, because I don't see it, but maybe I'm just at a different level, and it's no better or worse. It's just a different level of understanding in the industry. What are your thoughts on that, Dean?
So I go back to the shipper meeting I had, and they are really grappling with how far to keep dropping rates. Because make no mistake, they are acutely aware that rates are going to go up next year. What the dangerous game they're playing is continuing. The question is, how long do I continue to ask for lower rates? Because if they look down the road at the middle of next year, you can see rejection rates out the wazoo, for this low price freight. Because what happens is, if they play this game too far down in this cycle, rejection rates go through the roof in the middle of next year, for example. The next thing, they're paying 10x for loads on the spot market, blowing out their entire 2025 freight spend budget. The same thing happened in 2018, Dan. Remember the big earnings calls from the large shippers who were missing their earnings calls because of, quote, higher transportation costs? Dan, people were losing their jobs at the end of 2018 because they missed the market in 2018. It was nowhere near what we saw during the pandemic. So this is the really dangerous game people are playing right now. It comes back to you and I talked about always leave something for the next person in the deal, right? Leave some value for the next person, because if you don't leave some value in this for carriers on the way down in this cycle where everyone's getting margins compressed, you won't have capacity next year that's going to stick with you. And the capacity you find will be outside of your private network that you just talked about. Because those carriers, guess what those carriers do when rates are higher outside of that network of shippers?
They go outside.
Right. So we're about to see a similar scenario where I think a lot of shippers have got to a point where they need to start realizing they'll have serious routing guide failure within 12 months if we don't start to realize costs are much higher this time around. And that's, I think, part of your reason why you're not seeing the level of rate, obliteration that we've talked about. It's cost us a lot more to run trucks this market cycle than it has prior market cycles, to the tune of about 20 cents a mile higher than, say, what it was in 2019. And that's what I heard carriers say. It's costing us more. Driver wages went up this year. When you look at all the costs, fuel's come down, but wages were up. It's the second highest, or maybe the highest component of a P&L now for carriers. So they're at this floor. And if you keep driving the rate down while carriers are on their knees, they got no hesitation to go somewhere else when the volumes pick up next year.
It's interesting, Dean. Over the past couple of weeks, obviously with my new position, I've had a ton of conversations with shippers, more than I've had in a long time.
Right.
And I'm, me, I don't shy away from asking the questions regardless of which way it pushes, because I want to know, I want to understand. And I remember having a conversation with a very large shipper, and I asked him about all of this. I said, what are your personal thoughts on it? Like, let's take the company out of the equation, your mandates, your KPIs, all that stuff. Let's just throw that to the wayside for a sec. And he said, Dan, he said, I think both sides need a reality check. And I was like, wow, okay, because now he's not saying just carriers, he's saying both sides. He goes, so let me explain it to you this way, Dan. He goes, I believe, reality or not, I believe during the pandemic, I got fully taken advantage of.
Yes.
He said, I know rates went up, I know costs went up. He goes, but when you're 10x your cost, he goes, when my one lane that I know, if your driver wages go up 10%, I can see that. I see fuel's a separate cost in our freight agreement. So if fuel goes up, then the rate goes up. I get that. But when the actual line haul rate goes up 100% and driver wages go up 10, 15, he goes, even 20%, he goes, heck, even call it 50%, but my rate goes up 100%. I know that's somebody padding their pockets. And he said, and Dan, call a spade a spade. Well, he didn't say that. That's my term. But he said, call it like it is. That's what it was. Everybody was doing it. He goes, I saw it in 2018 with ELD. And he's a very smart individual. He knows most large carriers were already on ELD. Most carriers were on ELD for a year or two before ELD mandate. Right. It was the really small guys. And he goes, and I don't deal with the 1-2 trucking companies. So how did my costs change? He goes, so it's like, he goes, I understand supply and demand. I understand all the economics of it. He goes, but when I have a deal with somebody, nothing's changed in their book. And he's going back to 2018, not necessarily a pandemic, because in 2018, it was just the ELD mandate that came into effect. He goes, but one carrier that I was dealing with, they'd been on ELD for 2 years because we had the conversation almost 2 years prior. Their cost shot, like their price shot through the roof. He goes, so I know it was, oh my gosh, this is happening in the market. Let's capitalize on it. And you and I both know, we can both agree, there was massive capitalization during COVID. There was. And I think any for all of you watching and listening, if you say no, you're lying to yourself and you're lying to everyone around you. And he said, he goes, so yes, am I trying to take advantage of it? He says, yes, but he goes, I'm also being very fair to what I think. He goes, like, our company during COVID, he was at a different company. And he said, 50 years we made a profit. Those were the only 2 years we lost money. And he goes, and how does that happen? And, and then he went back to the whole C.H. Robinson story where there was that big report out where the steamship line says we didn't increase profits to this amount. It was the brokers doing it. And that's why steamship lines started creating their own supply chain deals and all. But anyways, so it was a very interesting conversation because I think it is happening. I think it's always going to happen. And I'm curious to see from you, or to hear from you, what are your thoughts about it? And is there a way, or is there a process, or what are your thoughts on how we can mitigate this in the industry?
So that shipper forgets that the rate increase during the pandemic in particular was because we've talked about shipping a lot of air. So it comes down to revenue per truck day. If you're keeping a truck sitting on a loading dock because you haven't got warehouse staff during the pandemic, your rates are going to go up. Right. Now, so remember, remember the stories about no one could find warehouse staff, they couldn't come to work, they couldn't get trucks loaded off loading docks. But what that translated into as detention time for truckers got longer and longer, their miles per truck day dropped further and further. That meant rate per mile had to go up higher and higher.
I forgot all about that, Dean.
Dan, it's pure economics. So what happened during the pandemic was we were shipping a lot of air, because they were sending trailers. You remember it. They were sending trailers, whether they were part full, half full, whatever. So it wasn't that we had more freight to haul. We were sending more trucks that were less full. That's the right grammar. It's probably not. So that's the part.
I get it, though. Don't worry about it. We use special grammar here all the time.
We're making our own language here. So a lot of people forget that they thought that demand was up in the pandemic. No, not necessarily. It's just that we had more trucks moving less freight. And that's what really drove this rate inflection that we saw during the pandemic. I think what shippers did is they reduced the velocity of trucks in the network. If you keep trucks sitting on loading docks for longer and longer, there's only one way this goes. And you saw the ATRI report come out this week. This is a $15 billion problem on detention times for the trucking industry. Dan, the data point that blew me away, and we could talk about this on next week's show, and it's probably a really good topic, but drivers are being detained for more than 2 hours in almost 40% of their stops. But here's the data point. Survey said that 94% of fleets charge detention fees, but only 50% get paid. So if you're not getting paid, so the data point from the ATRI survey, and this was done at the Mid-America Truck Show last year. So this represents a lot of smaller fleets, live load, drop and hook, flatbed, reefer, dry van. It said that 94.5% of fleets charge a detention fee, but fewer than 50% actually get paid.
Wow.
So in the post-ELD environment, right, where time is money and I've got a 14-hour clock on my window on my day, that's my limit of driving, you keep me for 5 hours on the dock and I lose, so 14 minus 5, I'm down to 9 hours of roll time instead of 11. My rate per mile just went up. So this hurts everybody in the industry because it gets to your point about we've got to get our drivers miles. Well, drivers don't want to be sitting on loading docks. And if you're a shipper in the food industry and beverage industry, you want to bet you're at the top of the 4-letter word list because they are notorious for long detention times. So, when I talk to shippers, it's like it's not even something on their radar, but it has such a profound impact on driver turnover and truck revenue per day. It's like there's this massive disconnect because the person that's buying the freight at the shipper side is not necessarily connected to the frustrations that go on at the dock door level. Like and I understand that it's a massive company. There's lots of moving parts in a P&L of the shipper. But if you said to me, what's the one thing you could do to really contribute to lower transport costs? Make sure trucks are moving on and off docks quickly. Like I see it from the carrier side all of the time, because if you're first of all allowing 2 hours free time where there's no detention charged, Like, that's nuts. Like, why would anyone allow anyone 2 hours free time without charging for it? Like, because that turns into 3 and 4, and then you see the signs for, at some shippers, live loads are at least 7 hours. Like 7.
Yeah, that's asinine. Yeah, that's crazy.
So I think, Dan, that's the thing that we've got to talk about.
Yeah, let's make that a topic for next week, because I remember that. I remember vividly having a conversation with FedEx, and the woman going, because I was actually looking for a package, and the woman going, I don't even know what to tell you. And I said, what do you mean? And she says, well, let me put it to you this way. We have 4 times the trucks arriving, and we have 1/3 of the staff to unload.
There you go.
Because we have to be 6 feet apart. People are, somebody gets COVID in the building. We got to shut down for this amount of time. We got to do this. I totally forgot about that, but it's amazing how fast we forget. So that's interesting. So yeah. Okay.
Well, it gets back to your tender rejection question, because it's not just at a market level, it's at a shipper level. Because if you've got the choice, why would you accept freight from a shipper where you're going to spend 5 hours getting in and out, as opposed to someone who's got you in and out, really fast? So even at a shipper level, rejection rates vary.
And obviously, okay, so based on that mentality, then prices went up, because if you're not going to pay detention time, I'm just going to charge you more to do the freight in general.
It's simple economics. I need $1,200 per truck day. Either way, if I'm not generating $1,200 per truck day, I'm going out of business quickly, no matter if I'm an owner operator or a large fleet. It's very simple economics when you run a truck P&L.